talk. So welcome, first of all, to the next seminar in the series of anti-Semitism in East and Southeast Asia in Comparative Perspectives. I'm very pleased to welcome for this week's talk, Professor Ran Zwigenberg, who is Associate Professor at Pennsylvania State University. His research focuses on modern Japanese and European history with a specialization in memory and intellectual history. He has taught and lectured in the United States, Europe, Israel, and Japan, and published on issues of war memory, atomic energy, psychiatry, and survivor politics. Professor Zwigenberg's first book, Hiroshima, The Origins of Global Memory Culture, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2014, was the winner of the 2016 Association for Asian Studies John W. Hall Book Award. And this dealt comparatively with the commemoration and the reaction to the Holocaust and the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. And today, Professor Zwigenberg will give a talk titled Eichmann Proxies, Jewish Survivors, Holocaust Psychology, and A-Bomb Research in Japan. He will talk for around 30 minutes, during which time you're welcome to write whatever questions you have for Professor Zwigenberg. And then there will be a 30-minute discussion moderated by myself in which I can put those questions and ask some of my own. So thank you very much, Professor, and I look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you also for ISGAP for hosting this. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. It's 11 p.m. for me now. I'm in Japan. So wherever you are on the globe, thank you for joining. Today, I'm going to, let me just share my screen here. So, my talk today is called Eichmann Proxies, and it refers to this image that you see here on the right, which is a caricature that was in the Yomiuri Shimbun, Yomiuri newspaper in Japan during the Eichmann trial. The proxies here, and this is what it says on the right, Eichmann ni kawaru mono, refer to the nuclear powers. If you can see here, so on the left, Soviet Union, France, the US, and the UK. And those Nazi-like figures, their head says kakuheiki, or nuclear weapons. The implication here is that new Nazis are nuclear powers and the new Jews, the victims. It's either all of us or, more directly, the Japanese victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This caricature is actually standing up for the way that people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and deal with the Jewish Holocaust, as it is called now, and with Jews as a whole. The Jews are seen as a foil, as proxies, as the whole story of the Holocaust is often used for promoting local ends and seen through the ideological and political concerns of Japan. However, in this moment, in 1962, it also was seen as something that can be bring those experiences together, the experience of the survivors of the Holocaust, experience of survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In my first book that Professor Ainsley mentioned, Hiroshima, The Origins of Global Memory, I focus on the way that survivors from Hiroshima and activists in Hiroshima went to Israel and went to Poland, those people you see here on the left, and tried to reach out to survivors. In the book that I just finished, that deals with trauma, I'm dealing with another thing that happened in 1962 and also was directly related to the Eichmann trial and to the rise of awareness to the Holocaust worldwide, and is a meeting between a Jewish American professor, psychologist named Robert J. Lifton, and a Japanese professor named Kubis Doshi, who met in 1962 in Hiroshima. Now, this meeting was complete failure. Lifton writes to his friend David Risman, I don't understand anything that this guy is trying to say, and not because of the language, my data translator, but because they had completely different ideas about survivor psychologies and what what the meaning of them within the context of trauma. Today, I'm going to talk about those completely different ideas that the people had in the West and had in Japan about survivor psychology and how the Eichmann trial and Robert Lifton meeting with Kubis Doshi impacted Japanese psychology of the bomb and more generally Japanese attitudes to the Holocaust. Now, throughout this talk today, we're going to go back and forth between 1962 and 1945. I'm going to go the first three parts of for the next 26 minutes we have left. I'm going to talk about generally about the state of Hiroshima up to 1962, up to the Eichmann trial, then talk about survivor and trauma in Israel, another place up to 1962, survivors and trauma in Hiroshima up to 1962, and then we'll look at the reaction to the Eichmann trial and take it beyond the Eichmann trial and the reaction to the meeting that Lifton had with Kubis and specifically about a Japanese psychologist named Ishida Tadashi and his rejection of the ideas of trauma. Now, I want to start in 1945 with the first reaction to Hiroshima in the United States, the country that dropped the bomb, and to show you a couple of quotes that show how immediately after the bomb, the Holocaust was immediately, it was not called the Holocaust at the time, immediately connected to the atomic bomb. The atomic bombing was a complete shock to the world. No one knew about the bomb, of course, beside a couple of people in the United States. And the suddenness of the destruction and the scale of destruction was a complete shock to many people. It was quite controversial among some quarters. Now, the people who resisted the bomb were a minority in the US, but it is notable that they used the Holocaust almost right away and to compare the Americans to the Germans. And you can have here both on the right and the left. Felix Morley was a conservative writer, Dwight MacDonald, Trotskyist, and far left. They both compare American conduct in Hiroshima to the German conduct in Buchenwald, in Majdanek, telling the Americans that we, the American people, are just as much or little responsible for the horror as the German people. Now, their call for clarity fell on, for a call for like moral, not clarity, sorry, I'm not really speaking English that much nowadays, Hansei, reflection. Reflection fell mostly on deaf ears at the time, because the majority of American people, the majority of American intellectuals also accepted the dropping of the bomb as something that was maybe regrettable, but necessary. In Japan, there was no place to those kind of discussion at all. It is because American censorship and American occupation made any kind of discussion, any kind of relationship of the Holocaust between what is we now call the Holocaust to Hiroshima completely out of the question. The only way you can talk about a bomb in Hiroshima at the time, and a lot of my first book deals with this, is through this prism of peace, that the bomb poses peace. And I brought you here a couple of quite extreme examples from newspapers in Hiroshima that talk about the bomb as the bright flash of peace. Like the first title here on the right talks about, this is from the first year anniversary of Hiroshima, talks about, here comes the day again, the day of the bright flash of peace, Heia no Senko. If you write it from right to left. Or here on the left, the requiem, the song of peace that comes from the sky, Amekudaru Heiwa no Jokyaku. And what is the requirement for peace? You can see the picture, right? The idea was that the bomb has brought peace, that transformed Hiroshima from the base of militarism. It was a very big military base next to where they dropped the bomb, into a city of peace. And commemoration, and I'm very reductive here and throughout the talk, we want to talk in a very big, like just in big strokes about what happened. Basically, commemoration in Hiroshima was very forward-looking, very optimistic. there is this narrative that the bomb leading from the bomb into peace. You can see it very much in the graphic here. Even a communist organization like the JT, or the Japanese Teachers Union, which was dominated by communists, accepted this, that a bomb has brought peace. You can see it like the doves that coming out of the bomb, right, with the atomic bomb dome. The bomb that brought us like energy, nuclear energy. We see the rose and the atomic energy here, or the bomb that made Hiroshima into a tourist site here on top. People come to Hiroshima to see the atomic cloud. Again, there's many things going on at the time, but the idea is that commemoration in Hiroshima is very forward-looking, and it's connected the bomb into the bringing of peace, and Hiroshima, making Hiroshima into a city of peace. This is a city that is not just Japanese, but cities is important for the whole world. Now, this continued after the occupation in the anti-bomb movement in the mid-50s, and also connected to the rise of survivors. In the mid-50s, after what's called the Lucky Dragon 5 incident, where Japanese were again exposed to radiation after American experiments, American test of hydrogen bombs in the Pacific, the anti-bomb movement brought survivors, very important, women survivors, on the stand to give their witness as witnesses to the horror of war, right? As I say, sense of war is bad. Nakinagara, while crying, they stood up and told their story. That's the first time survivors came in public and told their story. What they did here, by putting the survivors, specifically women survivors here in a poster here on the right, women, they put the victim in the center, the experience of Japanese victim in the center, right? Let's not talk about what Japanese did to other people, right? Japanese victims, specifically women and children, and they used what I call in the book emotional mobilization. The emotional mobilization happened here in two ways, both using the emotional experience of people hearing the testimony to mobilize them for the cause of peace, political mobilization, but also the survivors themselves, empowering the survivors by they mobilize their own emotions, their own grief, transform it into witness, into testimony, right? This is very similar to what the State of Israel did with survivors in the Eichmann trial, right? Where they put survivors on the test. This was Gideon Hausner, the prosecutor, and David Ben-Gurion, the prime minister, made a conscious decision to put survivors on the stand to tell their stories. It had very little to do with the prosecution against Eichmann itself. It was more about telling the world about the story of the Holocaust. And the exact same kind of mechanism happened during the Eichmann trial. Now, why did you need to tell the story of the Holocaust for people in 1962, 17 years after the war? Because people in Israel did not talk about it. The first 15 to 20 years after the war, it was not very acceptable to talk about what happened during the war and people in the camps. People did talk, and again, I'm generalizing here, but there was certain stigma of people that went through the camps. And you see the stigma and the anxieties that survivors of the camps had in Israel through the story of the ship of fools. There was a story in 1950s, a baseless rumor. There is a ship carrying 1,500 mentally damaged or mentally ill survivors, carrying them from the DP camps or from the displaced persons camp in Germany to Israel. Now, this rumor was again not correct, but the idea that it was a rumor, there was anxiety about it, show the status of survivors in Israel at the time, specifically people that had mental issues. There's something people did not talk about it. Now, some people like Leo Sroll, you can see him on the right, who was a military psychiatrist in the British Army that worked in the DP camps, did see that those people, like veterans of wars, suffer from what we will now call, wasn't called at the time, trauma, right? He compared it to shell shock and other things, other terms they used at the time. But the majority of psychiatric and psychological administration establishment in Israel did not see it like this. What they did see was Israel as a place for survivors to heal. Survivors actually, through their Zionist experience, right, will gain immunization from trauma in a healthy environment of Israel, specifically in the kibbutz. They will go there, and unlike people in the diaspora, they will heal. And people will not heal, people did not heal, this transformation as well, were suspect. Now, if Israeli doctors were suspicious, German doctors were completely hostile. Dagmar Herzog, Svenja Goldman, a lot of people wrote, Christian Post, a lot of people wrote about the hostility of German psychiatric establishment that was responsible for the compensation for survivors, to survivors. One thing that the German psychiatrists did was to use objectivity and causation in order to sow doubt. It's very hard to prove causation between the event and the mental disease. In trauma, there's a whole period, latent period, where nothing's supposedly happened. So what the German doctors did was that they basically said, you can see here in the first quote, that you cannot really say if the people were sick before 1945 or after 45 or something happened later on. Okay, and people who support, so the doctors support the victims are not objective, they're emotional. Now, after the Eichmann trial, this exact emotional side, right? The rise, political and cultural rise in the status of this is exactly what stopped the doubt, because I think see here with American Dr. Paul Chodoff, who worked with his patient, called him Lamed Tov, the Lamed Tov, the 36 tzaddikim, 36 just men, right? They were almost messianic religious figures, right? That bear witness to the horror of the Holocaust. You cannot doubt them the way the German doctors did. You can see also with Elie Wiesel here in this quote it actually does use the word messianic here, right? People will save us from a new Auschwitz. And this is again the context that I spoke on before, the context of Hiroshima, the context of civil rights, the context of bringing all those struggles together. It's the 60s, right? And using a survivor of the Holocaust as someone who can teach us a lesson, the same way that we use it more like today. We compare either in connection to human rights and the like. Right now, went back to the 60s, let's go back to 1945 again, right? So our third issue, survivors and trauma in Hiroshima. Now, in Hiroshima, the main kind of body that researched the impact of the bomb in Hiroshima was the ABCC, the American Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, which is an American research establishment in Hiroshima that had a tendency to dismiss long-term trauma and long-term impact of the bomb as a whole. Again, it's very, very complicated and there's various things going on here, but I want you to just focus on the logic that they use here, right? Okay, that whatever happened in 1945 cannot be isolated from many other important events of the era, that you don't know that the bomb caused the trauma. Just like the German doctors before. It's about sowing doubt. It's about not listening, not hearing, not seeing the suffering of the victims. Now, this was easy for Americans to do because the Japanese doctors themselves did not accept this. The Japanese doctors and Japanese psychiatry have a very long history, like German psychiatry, of ignoring trauma and not seeing trauma. You can see here, for example, in German military psychiatry in 1937, that says, trauma, shell shock, and something happened to weak Westerners. We, superior race, the Japanese, don't have trauma. Right? See here in the quote from Kamate Shirabe-san, that the military of the emperor does not have those weaklings. On a more direct connection to the Germans, he and other doctors called people who demand some kind of compensation for trauma, They call the suffering not from neurosis connected to war, but neurosis connecting their obsession to compensation, like Hosho Shinkeisho, like compensation neurosis. This is the exact term that the Germans use after World War I and then after World War II, Lenten neurotica, pension neurotics, right? So the idea is that the people are not sick because of what happened during the war, but they're sick because of their obsession to get free money, basically. Now, going back to Kubis Doshi in a meeting that he had with Lifton, Kubis Doshi was also a military doctor, and he carried with him this kind of doubt. But also, he carried with him also, again, German education, this reverence for objectivity, this reverence for scientific method. And here it was very interesting for me to see what he writes about, because he worked with Hibakusha, with survivors. And unlike, again, people like Dori Laub and other psychologists today that claim that survivors, the trauma actually gives survivors a certain specific, special truth. And you can see with Friedlander, the way I write about the Holocaust, Sal Friedlander and others, that survivors' testimony have a special truth that is different from, and sometimes superior, for Laub, superior to documentary truth, let's say, in written documents. Kubis Doshi actually see the experience of trauma as something that is making survivors unreliable. He said that here in panic behavior, like what you have is fragmentary. You shouldn't report this. You shouldn't bring the fragments together and make it a coherent story. You actually should fragment it together, doing it to abstract it. That's what he means by this. You should abstract it and look for general pattern and take one thing from here and one thing from there. In order, you have to have this, what you call a scientific method, to look for commonalities to ensure the analysis is objective as possible. He doesn't want subjective testimony. He wants objective science, right? Now, in here, the voices of and experience of the survivors are lost, but he does it not because he wants to treat survivors. He does it because he wants to use the voice of survivors in order to pursue peace. He was very active in this group of Japanese psychologists for peace. Here, this manifesto they wrote as part of this global movement about tension that cause wars, how we can prevent the next war, okay? And this group also had other people who worked on Holocaust, and worked on Holocaust psychology. They read, for example, Bruno Bettelheim, mass behavior in extreme situations. Now, it was very, again, interesting for me to see that they really don't care about the experience of trauma, the experience of victims. What they care about is how the victims lost their individuality, because what they care about is their own experience during the war. They care about the Japanese experience. Again, it's about proxies. It's about using the Jewish experiences full to understand their own experience. And you can see here that they read Bettelheim, and what they see is that Japan became a big concentration camp, right? It's about the experience of totalitarianism. And now they don't misread Bettelheim, because Bettelheim himself, right, write about it in a commentary on Hannah Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem. He writes that accounts were really one part of the massive planted grade, the 1,000-year totalitarian Reich. The Holocaust was not the last chapter in anti-Semitism, but rather one of the first chapters in modern totalitarianism. What they care about, what Bettelheim care about, was about human behavior under totalitarianism, under fascism. And right, and you can see here also Shimizu Takagi, another member of this group, that is worried about how the democracy will turn into totalitarian. Now, those things, 1950, 1955, again, you see it in the Eichmann trial himself, moving now to the trial and beyond, right? When you look at the reactions to the Japanese reaction to the Eichmann trial, you see that what they care about, again, is other thing than Jewish victimization as a whole. They care about the trial and what it means about the Japanese experience during the war. Again, remember making the Japanese here the real victims. You see here, for example, how they see, how they say that like the Westerners thought it's cruel to behead people with a samurai sword. Maybe now people see it as cruel to kill people with a nuclear bomb, right? There's also this idea that they're actually morally superior to the Jews because they forgave the Americans. So there's all this talk about eye for an eye, right? And I think the Jews are cruel by killing Eichmann, right? So you see that we should forget about this eye for an eye because we're just going to have more war like this. We should not throw stone after stone into a lake that tries to recover its serenity. They actually look down on the Jews and think they're too vengeful. Going back to this caricature here, right? Other people, again, going back to this idea of totalitarianism, think about what happened to the Japanese during the war, right? About group thinking. When one person think like 10,000, this was actually a motif in anti-nuclear thought, that one of the big problems that people don't think for themselves, and there's going to become what called groupthink, and it will lead to another war. Takayama Michio, actually, which is the author of a book called The Heart of Burma, it's a very famous book about Japanese atrocities, actually use it to berate the Japanese, that they were saying that they were deceived, but actually the Japanese here were, during the war, acting like the Nazis. But he was kind of a lone voice here. And we can go back to it later. I just want to continue to lift on here. So the trial shows all those various reactions to the Holocaust, but I want to go back to psychology. Okay, so Robert Lifton gets to Hiroshima, talks to, but he comes from the world, he's Jewish American, he's come from intellectual world that was very much impacted from the Holocaust, and he was very much in contact with all those people that were fighting for compensation for Jewish survivors. He's also very, very active in the anti-nuclear circles. And what he came specifically to Hiroshima to do was to connect the Jewish experience with the Jewish experience and other experience of disaster and genocide, and to compare it to Hiroshima. You want to see that what exposure to atomic bomb in Hiroshima resembles psychological and social patterns common to all disasters. Now here is like Cuba, he wants something, he wants commonalities, but he wants something that's common to one particular person, which is a survivor. Now we think about calling victims survivors is something that we do all the time now, but at the time people did not call Holocaust, it's not a Holocaust at the time, right? In the 60s, we didn't really call them survivors. The rise of the survivor is something that happened from the 60s and 70s onward. And psychology has a big part of it. And you see with the rise of the survivor, you also see the rise of what become PTSD. Because what Lifton find and other people find afterward, they found a model in the survivors, an inspiration, model inspiration in the survivors. What he sees, and you can see here in a meeting, it's a very important meeting he had in '68 in Detroit, with people like Henry Christel, Netherlands, and other people that worked on compensation, that for him, it's more than just psychology. It's about fighting the threats to our future. He sees Hiroshima and the Holocaust as a common threat, right? And other people also see it, and they see what people have in common, right? Again, going back to Elie Wiesel, which is a friend of Lifton, they also hope in the survivor struggle. The survivors can actually lead us away from the era of war, from the threat of extinction. Again, it's the era of Vietnam also. And when they see, like so you see the quote here from Christel, that all those people have the exact same traits, right? Survivor guilt, identification with death, and all this stuff. You can see that we have something here, right? And this something will become PTSD, right? Eventually. Lifton become very involved together with Chaim Shatan and almost all those people are Jews, with helping Vietnam veterans. And it's coming together of like the experience of Vietnam, experience of Hiroshima, experience of the Holocaust, together with people who work on domestic violence against women, people who work on minorities. This would eventually bring PTSD in 1980. But in Japan, there is a complete rejection of PTSD up to 2000. Why is that? Now, initially, people like Ishida Tadashi is a psychologist that was in Hiroshima, was very, very impressed by Lifton. But there's a feeling, to see here in this quote here, that it's somehow unfair that someone like Lifton could make such a breakthrough in psychology while Japanese did not, right? And what Ishida Tadashi is kind of saying that is because Lifton is Jewish, right? Because Lifton is Jewish, he has this unfair advantage that he couldn't have this because he understands the experience of Auschwitz. There's a lot of hostility towards Lifton in Hiroshima for various reasons. And for Ishida is almost personal in a way. He really appreciates Lifton, but he's also very critical of him. And I can go to why afterwards. What's important for me, and this is where actually I'm going to end, about the rejection of trauma, that rejection of trauma by Ishida doesn't mean the rejection of the Holocaust. Now, Ishida have this idea, and he have it in his book called Hangenbaku, like anti-bomb, that the survivors have transform and overcome trauma. Like both him and Lifton has the idea of reformulation, that by giving witness and by talking about their experiences and by political activity, this is what he has, survivors can leave trauma behind. They can turn from drifters, sufferers, victims, into survivors or survivor heroes, people who struggle against the bomb. Okay, and he gets this idea through his reading of Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. He has this, he quote this really long quote from Frankl, which he ends with this quote from Spinoza, from Spinoza, that a suffering ceases to be suffering as soon as we form a clear and precise picture of it. Now, let's think a little bit about the importance of objectivity for Japanese psychologists. What he wants, right, is an objective understanding of what happened, and through, out of time. And he thinks that through objective understanding, right, you can understand your suffering and then overcome it. And he talks to, and here from a speech he gave for a group of social workers, he said, that Frankl method, there's the idea that it's this passage in Man's Search for Meaning when Frankl talks about how he managed to get away from the suffering in Auschwitz by imagining himself being in a cozy lecture room, giving a lecture about the Holocaust, right? That's how he managed to get away from his suffering in a camp while he was in a camp. And for him, this was an extremely objective way, right? This is, this is what extremely objective way to get a sense of your own struggles, right? And he talks about how people need to confront what happened, to establish himself or herself as a subject who can overcome, and overcoming is what's important for him. For him, trauma is a negative thing. People should not live with trauma. We should, through political struggle, overcome trauma. Right? And this is the ethos of the survivor movement. This is the ethos of people who work with social workers, psychologists, work with the bomb at the time. And they use, again, use Holocaust psychology that came from very different place and had very different lessons in the West to have their own lesson and their own understanding of it in Japan. All right, I should stop here, and we can go back to any of it later on. This is all from a book I just finished, so it might be a little bit all over the place. So please ask me whatever you want. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Zwigenberg. This was one of the kind of most in-depth, I think, intellectual talks we've had so far. And it's the area that I was saying to my colleagues before that I probably actually know the least about, because this really goes into depth about the understanding or the historical understanding or the development of the historical understanding of trauma and the parallels and the differences between using the events such as Hiroshima and of course the Holocaust to better understand those. And I find this quite fascinating within the Japanese context. I'm going to sort of fire a few questions of my own, and there are a few that will come in from the panelists. I invite everyone to contribute there. But first of all, I have a few questions based on notes that I made throughout that, because I found it absolutely fascinating. I noticed at one point that one of your quotes mentioned Vietnam, as well as Hiroshima and the Holocaust. So I wondered if, was that also a part of the discussions and the formulation of the understanding of PTSD? Did Vietnam and everything that happened in Vietnam, or perhaps other parts of the world, did they contribute to this narrative? Or was this mostly kind of the Holocaust and Hiroshima? I noticed also that you mentioned Hiroshima a lot and not Nagasaki as well. And I was sort of wondering why that emphasis is the way it is too. This is the first of many questions that I have.
Okay, should I take more, or?
I suggest if you sort of answer what I came up with first, and then we'll go along and continue the discussion.
Okay, so Vietnam, actually, there's so much to talk about all of those things, and I really struggle to, to bring like the big arch of the argument without getting into the weeds about it. But Vietnam, usually in a history of PTSD, Vietnam's giving a very large place, Vietnam and the Holocaust. And Hiroshima is almost not talked about at all. And this got a lot to do with the way that Hiroshima as a whole is not considered to be central nuclear weapons. This threat nuclear weapons central. PTSD trauma studies came out in the 90s as a cultural trauma studies. And it was and by then nuclear weapons, Hiroshima was not as important as Vietnam was. If you think about Bosnia and the place of My Lai and it's a very, very American, right? Very American dominated field. So Vietnam is really very big, very high, and Lifton was very, very important in Vietnam. So Vietnam, and we talk about the soldiers, American soldiers, right?
Mm-hmm. And was this?
Yeah.
Was this also informed by what seemed to be the Japanese rejection of PTSD?
No, this is all inter-Japanese. I mean, all of those debates are in Japanese. Very little of it comes out until later on. Now, I mentioned Nagasaki. Ishida worked mostly in Nagasaki. Hiroshima is just much more global-faced, and this is where Lifton worked. Nagasaki is farther away from Hiroshima. Not many people get there. There are various reasons why also Hiroshima is more of, it was the first, it's much more of a quote-unquote brand. I hate to talk about like this, but this is, Hiroshima should not stand for Nagasaki. There's a lot that happened in Nagasaki. It's very different. But for the purpose of our talk, I talk mostly about Hiroshima. But again, Nagasaki have a very important history of its own.
Mm-hmm. Just continuing that slight discussion of PTSD and the understanding or the construction of PTSD and the understanding of it as a sort of historical narrative here. I was interested when you did mention the initial Japanese rejection of PTSD as a concept. What was that criticism and rejection based upon? I mean, was this based on nationalism or racial politics, for example?
Not quite. Not quite racial politics or nationalism, but it's about the uniqueness of the experience. It's something you can see also with Holocaust. They claim they don't want to relativize the experience. It's kind of like the 1980s debates in Germany about the relativization of the Holocaust, the historians' debates. Or debates we just had now in Holocaust studies about, can you compare the Holocaust to colonialism? They think that Hiroshima and Nagasaki are a unique experience and you should not connect them to other experiences, and just going to dilute the power. And they also think that Lifton was very hostile to activism, which is not true, but it's how they saw it. And again, they don't want to tar survivors, which for them are ideological heroes, with the stigma of being mentally ill. And I think that this is the major thing, that the stigma against mental disease, it's something that's still pretty strong. And still to today, it's very hard to talk about it to people.
Sure. What, given that stigma and perhaps the rejection or lack of understanding of PTSD, what were the sicknesses and the trauma of the survivors, and what was that attributed to?
Yeah, that's something I struggle with throughout the book, because if something was not studied as PTSD or trauma at the time, I cannot sit in my historian couch and analyze people 50 years ago based on fragmentary evidence. So I did look at what people did seek, and they talk about mostly radiation-related symptoms, and they took everything related to radiation and didn't quite know what. So fatigue is a very big thing. There's a disease called Buru-Buru-Bio, which means like a fatigue syndrome. Basically, it's very similar to Gulf War syndrome in its symptoms. This is something people a lot talk about. They didn't know a lot about radiation and what it does to the body at the time. And again, radiation really, because I think is the big difference in Hiroshima and Holocaust is that Holocaust happened and it's over physically, right? And the physical pain is over. Hiroshima, the radiation is still in the bodies of the survivors, and it still torment them, and the anxiety about being sick. It's very similar to AIDS patient, is almost as bad mentally as what happened at the time. So it's very, very complicated. Also, the psychiatrist, I mean, I don't want to condemn them. It's not here like they should have seen is that it doesn't work. We're not smarter than them. They were working within their own historical context, right?
Sure.
So the main problem was radiation. Okay, to make a very complicated.
Sure. That makes perfect sense, I would say. And this is a phenomenon that wouldn't be understood so much, I guess, in physically and mentally, the effects of which wouldn't be. You talked about at one point in Israel, the Eichmann trial is sort of elevating Holocaust survivors, so sort of changing them from victims to being survivors who needed to be elevated in society and listened to. Do we see a similar phenomenon happening in Japan? You touched on that a little bit about the survivors of Hiroshima and maybe Nagasaki. Is there sort of an element that at some point, is there a process whereby at some point in history, these people and their memories became significant and they became survivors rather than victims, or they were constructed as that?
Yeah, so it happened before the Eichmann trials, the Lucky Dragon 5 incidents, caused a huge, did I mention before? I should have mentioned it caused a huge panic because there was radioactive rain in Japan, and also the tuna catch in the ocean got radioactive. And so there's like a whole panic of people of eating radioactive. It also happened in the West Coast of the United States. And it caused a huge upswing in anti-nuclear feeling, and it was a very big anti-nuclear movement. And the survivors up to the time were basically ignored, saw it as an opportunity to pressure the government for compensation. And this is the moment where they decide to speak up. And this is the moment where you start seeing this transformation. Now, it took a long time, and there still was and still is discrimination against survivors in marriage.
When you say they decided to speak up, how did this happen? Were they sort of invited to talk, or were
they came out as an organization? It's in both the Holocaust and Hiroshima, compensation is very important. Because once you have compensation, you have people that need to file things in a medical legal way and political way, and they have to formulate their demands in some way. And this is where people start feeling they should talk, right? And there are people who are starting to collect testimonies and tell people. I mean, the people collect testimonies from 45 onward, but with specific reason, goal of putting them on a stand to talk in public. then other people.
When did things like the museums and the memorials
mid-50s. Mid-50s.
Oh, so that was quite soon, actually. Okay.
Yeah, but also 10 years after, same in Israel, Yad Vashem is 55, almost the same time.
I didn't realize all of those organizations so early, actually. We have a question here, which seems to be quite an interesting and relevant question. It says, how do we give voice to the profound moral difference for the circumstances that caused the trauma? So Nazi instigation versus US response to Pearl Harbor, for example, while recognizing the commonality of the conditions experienced by trauma victims. So giving voice to the moral difference for the circumstances that caused the trauma, and also recognizing the commonality of the conditions experienced by the victims. So this means that the cause is very different in terms of its meaning and its morality, but yet the experience can be common in the sense that we see common symptoms to PTSD. I think that's a very interesting question. Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, well, I'm a historian, not a philosopher, but I can tell you what people did in the past. But
please do, please do. Yeah.
Well, you know, people, the fact that you have this common medical, scientific category of PTSD, it's give people the basis, the universal basis to bring to reach out to each other and recognize each other. And sometimes it's done in a very unsensitive way, like the Hiroshima people that I talked about before. And it's decided to take ashes from Auschwitz and bury it in Hiroshima. No one asked if it's okay from Jewish law or whatever, but they did it. And did a couple of times actually. But the idea, again, morally, it was very noble, like that, you know, we were both victims of war. Okay, they're going beyond the particular historical, right? And we can work together for peace, right? But of course, once you remember, that's how memory works. Once you commemorate something, you forget many other things, right? So you commemorate this, and then you forget what the Japanese did in Asia. You don't forget, you just don't talk about it too much. And you know, this is like this ghost of Japanese atrocities is hovering around this whole thing all the time, because the whole Japanese peace movement and their moral case is based on victimization, while at the same time they're victimizers.
I find that very interesting, obviously being based in China, where the narrative of Japanese aggression is one that is often paralleled with that of Nazi aggression.
But that's actually, I mean, I want to go, I don't want to forget about this question. But you know, when Nanking Museum was opened in 1985, right? You know that,
yes.
Right? The PRC, the Public Republic of China, supported the Japanese movement up to the 80s, also with money, and they send delegation every year because they supported the narrative of the victimization of Japanese people by the capitalists and the militarists and the Americans. Whatever that made the Americans look bad, the Chinese were for. Okay, it's different in Korea, but again, the politics is so complex, and let's go back to the moral issue. It's very, very hard because you cannot, once you take it out of the historical context, you get into all those minefields. And the simplest way to deal with this morally is to recognize the human aspect, right? The fact is, the fact that those people are human, right? They're not good or bad or morally perfect. No victims are, and this is what sometimes kind of get to me when we talk about survivors. We make them into those, you know, saints, but they're not saints; they're people. And I think that this is the most sensible way. I don't know if the moral way, most sensible way is to reach out some kind of a common humanity that we have, to remember that, you know, history is complicated, and people can be both victims and victimizers, because what does make a person a victimizer, right? Unless you have someone who's physically in China doing something bad and then go back to Hiroshima. Might have been some people like that, but it's going to be very hard to find.
Thank you. I think that's a very good answer to that question. We have a comment actually, which I think goes back to when we were talking about the ongoing sort of radiation sickness, of physical maybe sickness of Japanese survivors, and we have a comment that Holocaust survivors were also physically sick as well, and needed kind of years of treatment. So we talk about sort of the mental anguish there, mental damage, but I think there's a comment that sort of points out that this was also physical damage at the same time as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, again, and throughout all this talk, I used, even if we said Holocaust survivors, like Holocaust survivors in Eastern Europe is very different from Western Europe and very different from Israel. People within Israel, people who came from Greece, and people who went through the camps, people who went to the Soviet Union and came back. It's very, very different. Generally speaking, yes, of course, there were people who were sick. Of course, a lot of people were physically invalid. How do you say it in English? I don't know if you can say invalid anymore. And handicap, right? Of course, but radiation stays you until you're dead, right? And people have onset of cancers again and again and again. And the specific issue with radiation is that you can never recover from it. You can never completely recover from it. Like if anybody ever had cancer or someone had cancer in their family, you always live with the anxiety that every little thing that is wrong with your body means the return of cancer. And this is the anxiety that I was talking about, which is different from being handicapped in other ways. And again, I think and again, I mentioned AIDS patient, because I think it's very similar, because also there is another factor here of social discrimination against them, because they're seen as tainted, both AIDS patient and survivors. So people don't want to marry them. People don't want to give them jobs. Also, they have the fatigue issues that they can't do physical labor. So actually, socioeconomically, a lot of those people, and yeah, it also happened in Holocaust survivors, but also economically, a lot of those people will be will not be very well off, because they left, they couldn't hold a steady job. So this is what I was talking about. And again, none of it means that there's not a competition who suffers more, right? It's just different.
Yeah, of course. We've got 4 minutes left of the seminar. So I sort of, as a final question, I'd sort of like to kind of pull it back to the contemporary period and anti-Semitism and constructions of Judaism in the contemporary period, which is what our sort of seminar series is all tied together by. And I'd sort of like to ask you, how much of all of the history that you've just mentioned and all of the constructions, how much of it informs contemporary Japanese constructions of and attitudes to Jews and Judaism in Israel? Do we see this invoking of parallel suffering, this construction of this negative construction of Jewish people that you talked about, as impacting Japanese attitudes? Because we know, of course, that there is anti-Semitism within Japan, and it's relatively high for the region. So how much of what you talked about impacts contemporary Japanese constructions of Japan? Okay,
yeah, I should have talked about more, but I want to go back to the image I started with here. You can see an image of on the left, Anna Frank, on the right of Sadako Sasaki, which is a very famous child victim of Hiroshima. And it's about his parallels, right? It's very, very popular. Anna Frank is maybe not the most popular figure of Holocaust figure in the world, but mostly in Japan, she's still being read avidly. My kids have a manga version of her story. You can find in almost any bookstore. Sadako Sasaki as well, which is very famous. And there's this parallel that we're both victims of the war. It's something that's still very, very popular in Japan. Anti-Semitism in Japan is always connected to philo-Semitism at the same time. There's this strange kind of, on one hand, the Japanese trying to show that they were very, very humane towards the Jews. And again, it's always about Japan. It's never about the Jews. There's no Jews in Japan, almost. Well, I'm there. But anti-Semitism in Japan is always kind of connected to both philo-Semitism and like this belief of the magical power of the Jews. But also...
This is very, very similar to constructions within China and within South Korea as well, this connection between anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism and the connection to localized sort of racial politics and forms of nationalism and the effects of rapid modernity. This seems to be something that is very common to this region, and we keep coming back to it, I almost feel, in this series.
Yeah, and they use the parallels. I mean, go back to Sasaki and Frank, the parallel between Hiroshima and Nagasaki to show, we share this thing. We share this thing that we're both victims and we both suffered in order to connect it. And of course, there is, we didn't talk about, like this rescuing of Jews and Chinue and all this stuff, but Sugihara, Chinue, and all this stuff. But there's a very big part of it. There was an exhibit in Tokyo where they put Anne Frank and Sugihara right next to each other, like he saved her, which is totally silly because he was in the Soviet Union and he saved Jews before the Nazis even came, a year before the invasion. Like the whole thing is completely historical, but it's about parallels. It's about making the Japanese not the bad guys, not the people who were allies of the Nazis, but as rescuers of Jews, who were victims like the Jews. It's about shifting them in this morality play into the good guys.
That's interesting that you mentioned Sugihara, actually, because I also see him a lot in China. He's part of the Chinese narrative as well, sort of given that so many of the Jews that he saved, I think, moved on to the Shanghai community. So he's quite actually he's a fairly big part of that narrative, larger than you think, given that he's Japanese.
Well, I'd like to hear more about that. That's a twist in the plot I haven't thought about.
Okay, it's just come up to the hour, so I think we're just about finished. Brilliantly, wonderfully on time. I'd like to say thank you very much, Professor Zwigenberg. I learned an awful lot tonight, and this was extremely in-depth and deeply philosophical, and I see that people are already sending in messages of thanks. So thank you for giving us your time, and thank you for such an in-depth and deeply interesting and moving presentation. So thank you from myself.